You're listening to a Chemical Conversations podcast. I'm Lauren Williamson, VP for Commercial Product for Argus Chemicals. And today we're diving into the chlorine markets. It's a good time to explore this commodity because Argus has just launched its chlorine analytics service, which includes a 10-year forecast for both global fundamentals and price data. It's also a good time for discussion because there's some key swing factors affecting the chlorine space, which ultimately require expertise to really understand. In today's discussion, we are featuring our chlor-alkali experts at Argus, Stephanie Koenig in Europe, Bernard Law in Asia, and George Eisenhauer in the Americas. Stephanie, the European chlor-alkali industry has been in a downturn for some time. Are there any signs that a recovery is imminent?
You're right. We've been in a downturn for about 18 months. It's a significant one. It's a long one. We've seen chlorine demand contract by at least 20%. There are no signs that a recovery is imminent, but we are cautiously optimistic about next year. So for once, we believe that the demand has finally bottomed out and that from maybe some seasonal changes to chlorine demand, especially during winter, we won't see any further erosion. There are also very slightly encouraging signs coming from the economy side of things. So we see inflation being brought under control across the major European economies. The European Central Bank has just left interest rates stable. And even though we don't know if that's it or if further intervention is needed, it's certainly going into the right direction. So I believe we do need these signs that costs are under control, taking out credit will be a lot cheaper, and customers and investors need that kind of confidence to start spending again. So while we believe the recovery is not going to start early in 2024, we believe we could see the begin of it at one point next year.
Thanks for that response, Stephanie. And maybe we could turn this to a longer term view now. If you could think about the next 5 to 10 years, what are the opportunities and challenges you see for chlorine in Europe during that time period?
Okay, chlorine is a difficult market. Unfortunately, I would say we probably see more challenges than opportunities. So we are quite a mature industry here in Europe. There's no real new end use emerging that could drive or industry growth or help shape the industry in the future. So we see quite a few challenges in that, and they all always come down to the same thing, which are costs. So Europe is a high cost producing region, and global comparison always has been. That's not going to go away. And we will see the additional cost burden that comes with the transition to net zero and the investment that will be required at each and every company to meet sustainability targets. So for us, that actually raises the question whether chlorine demand will fully recover from the current low, or whether we will perhaps start to see some industry consolidation, whether perhaps some companies along the supply chain may not survive the current downturn or simply may not have the financial means to invest or remain competitive in the global market. We are slightly more positive when we look at the other side of the ECU, the caustic soda side. We have the same cost issues. Again, they're not going to go away. If anything, they will be compounded by the transition to net zero. But at least we do have new demand in the battery materials. And looking at chlor-alkali and chlorine and caustic soda together, it actually raises the question for us, are we going to be okay in terms of caustic soda supply to meet demand and therefore in terms of chlorine output? Or are we going to face challenges? Is chlorine going to bring challenges for the other side of the ECU in terms of supplies?
Bernard, the global economy is facing huge risks of recession. We're seeing a lot of concern around the Eurozone, a lot of challenges in China, and of course, the global economy is very interconnected. So, with this darkened economic outlook, how do you see the chlorine and chlorinated derivative market in Asia performing during this time?
Let's look at the chlorine and chlorinated market in Asia, and it is rather complex as you look at it. Asia is such a big continent, and we cannot you cannot just draw write a simple sentence or summarize it. And I would like to look at this in a different way, region by region. And first and foremost, uh, I, li- I would like to take a look at the chlorine and the caustic cycle. Yeah, and generally the cycle, the demand growth normally tracks the general the GDP performance. Yeah, and however, the chlorine demand growth appeared to be more sensitive to the GDP fluctuations. And what it means here is whenever there's a GDP changes, like going to recessions or undergoing a growth, a steady growth, you can really see how the chlorine will react, will be more sensitive, will react to the growth, to the demand growth. Yeah, and but on the caustic soda side, the demand growth is pretty much related to manufacturing. It's less sensitive, and normally it reacts slower to the GDP fluctuation. Yeah, based on these fundamental actually principles in the chlorine and the caustic cycle. And let's look at the Northeast Asia first. Northeast Asia is Asia largest supply base and as well as the largest consumption based. Yeah, and as a rule of thumb, and 1/3 of chlorines will go into vinyl, and the rest of the 2/3 will go into various downstream, and such as MDI, TDI, propylene oxide, inorganic chemicals, intermediates, and so on. Yeah, and in such a depressed market like what we are seeing today, yeah, um, in fact, the impact on vinyls is more evident, it's clearer that we can see. And we can really see the PVC prices has been coming down for the last several months, and it fell pretty sharply actually. And we expect the vinyl market to remain soft in the near term. And whereas the impact on other downstream, the non-vinyl downstream, is severe, but it is not as bad as in vinyl. Yeah, and we just got to look at the region outside China. Yeah, and which made up of region in Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. And chlorine forms the one of the major part of the downstream. The vinyl form the major part of the downstream. And in fact, 30 to 40% of the chlorine goes into the vinyl, yeah, in the region itself. And they export a very sizable, up to 50%, in fact, of their PVCs, of their vinyl, especially the PVC, out of the country in order to balance the chlor-alkali chain. Yeah. So, but in China itself, this is pretty good. This is typical of the chlorine downstream. About 1/3, about 30% of it, slightly more than close to 30% of it actually go into vinyl. And China has a huge chlorine consumption base, and the whole domestic consumption itself can balance itself. And it's only a very small percentage of maybe 5 to 10% of the PVCs are being exported. That means they are bringing the chlorine out of the market in order to balance the chlor-alkali chain. Yeah. And next region we would like to look at is Southeast Asia. South Asia is pretty much fragmented, but there are two main countries, Thailand and Indonesia. These two countries actually have a very high percentage of chlorine go into the vinyl. Yeah. And they have a big domestic market. At the same time, they also export quite a bit of the caustic into the neighboring countries and going to India as well. Yeah, and the rest of it, and the rest of the chlorines, and is go into a very simple derivatives like hydrochloric acid and the merchant chlorine go into water treatment, the sodium hypochlorite. These are the simpler version of the derivatives. Yeah, and in Southeast Asia, you don't have those MDI, TDI kind of downstream industries. Yeah. Now, we're going to look at next is the Middle East. Middle East are pretty straightforward chlorine market. 40% of the chlorine actually goes into vinyl, and the rest of the chlorine is kind of really interesting because it is a market with a lot of oil and gas industry, and they produce a lot of chlorine actually go into productions of hydrochloric acid for to be used in the oil drilling as well. And some of the chlorine will go into calcium chloride and to use in the drilling process as well. Yeah. So now look, the last region we want to look at is India. India is rather they have a very fragmented chlorine downstream, and it's only 8% of the chlorine, close to 8% of the chlorine goes into vinyl, and the rest of it are very fragmented. They go into the chlorinated paraffins, they go into intermediates, the chemical intermediates, the water treatment, and they produce a lot of hydrochloric acid, some of them for export and so on. So when you look at it, that's because it's such a fragmented market for chlorine. The chlorine value, in fact, in India itself, always falls into negative. It's always negative value, meaning that currently the chlorine in India is about negative maybe 3 to 5,000 rupees per ton ex-tanks. And it depending on customer size and depending on the consumptions and so on, it's still holding in the negative territory for a long time. Yeah.
So George, since September of this year, we've seen a lot of chlorine capacity idled on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Can you tell us how that's affecting the market right now?
So we've seen several plants on the U.S. Gulf Coast idled, mainly by Olin, one in Freeport and one plant in St. Gabriel. Argus estimates the capacity of those two plants is somewhere around about 1 million tons of capacity, or roughly 8% of the U.S. market. Part of this is attempting to reduce the overcapacity in the marketplace in the U.S. So we've seen a significant decline in operating rates. So if you look at operating rates in October, they were maybe in the low 60s. According to our estimates. This is down maybe 20% from earlier in the year. So we've had a significant decline in chlorine demand in the domestic market. A lot of it has to do with the slowing economies globally. And part of it also has to do with the fact that, if you look at the U.S. Gulf Coast, or it's not just Gulf Coast, but the U.S. economy is slowing from a 5%, almost 5% growth rate in Q3 to maybe a 1% growth rate in Q4. So a significant decline in growth. And when that happens, chlorine demand has typically does decline as well. A lot of it has to do with the fact that the domestic U.S. market has been slowing. We've seen that reduced capacity, reduced demand is playing out in potentially lower pricing for chlorine. We've seen chlorine prices actually decline for most of this year. And with these assets being idled, potentially this is going to support maybe a stabilization of chlorine pricing in the market. We haven't really seen any significant movement in chlorine in the last month or so, but there is a potential that the prices will stabilize, if not maybe return and start to move higher as prices or as demand recovers.
All right, and of course, the idling of capacity is often due to weak demand. Can you talk about which chlorine derivatives are currently holding up best, which are struggling, and when do you think demand might recover overall?
So looking at the chlorine market, the most resilient chlorine demand in the marketplace right now is actually in the vinyls industry, which to a certain degree is a little bit surprising because the domestic U.S. housing market has been so weak the last couple of months and maybe in the entire year this year. A lot of that has to do with high interest rates for mortgage notes and people not buying houses as readily as they used to or did last year. But the interesting thing about the PVC market is the U.S. Gulf Coast has an ethylene advantage, has an energy advantage, and is able to move that chlorine into PVC at a competitive rate on a global basis. So from that perspective, even though the domestic U.S. PVC market might be weak, we're actually able to be competitive on the export market, and that is actually supporting the PVC operating rates in the U.S. Other industries are again struggling. Several of them are. A lot of them have to do with the building industry. So again, the high interest rates are reducing demand for housing, and a lot of times, when you're dealing with housing, you're dealing with demand for TiO2 pigments for your paint, for example. A lot of the TiO2 operators plants are running at relatively low operating rates. We're estimating somewhere in the neighborhood of around mid 60% operating rate level. There are some other chlorine derivatives that may be weaker, but they're a much smaller piece of the pie. So some of your products like MDI, TDI are also running at low rates. In the last couple of months, we've seen TDI or MDI operating rates in the mid 50s. So these are again signs of weakness in the domestic U.S. economy and weakness for demand for chlorine. As far as an outlook, as far as when chlorine demand might be recovering, that's kind of anybody's guess to a certain degree, because we look at the economy, and right now we're seeing a slowing economy. And as long as the economy is slowing, not only in the U.S. but globally, that has a tendency to decline or reduce demand for chlorine. And really and truly, not until the economies on a global basis start to recover from the slowdown period will chlorine demand actually start to recover.
That's all we have time for on this podcast. Thank you for listening. If you'd like more information, please visit www.argusmedia.com/chemicals.